Then we're ready to begin. Good morning, everyone, and I'll call to order a special meeting of the Arkansas Public Employees Retirement System. And the news media was notified pursuant to Act 93 of 1967. And I recognize the presence of a quorum. I believe all the board members are in attendance, so thank you for your attendance this morning. And I would like to start off with our executive director. Duncan, if you would like to make a few remarks before we begin, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to welcome everyone to the meeting this morning. I wanted to remind everyone that, as in our previous meetings, we have Jacobia Twiggs from APERS who is hosting the meeting, so she'll help us navigate the muting of microphones and the various things that we need to navigate as we go through Zoom. I wanted to mention that, as the chair mentioned, we do have the press and the public here. At the last meeting, we had excellent attendance. If you look at the minutes, we have an extremely long list of members who attended the meeting. Once again, today we have, on our panelist side, 15 panelists, and we have over 40 attendees right now. So I think we've got, once again, excellent attendance from the public and from our membership. I wanted to mention today that, what we're doing today is a follow-up from our last meeting. At the last meeting, we worked on our 2021 legislative package. We continued that discussion today. At the last meeting, we requested some feedback from our stakeholder group. So you'll see on the agenda, we have the Association of Counties, the Municipal League, and the State Employees Association here today. And when we get to that portion of the agenda, Jacobia will bring them into the discussion. I did want to mention, just from a goals perspective, just some thoughts about today. I think we've worked to, between the last meeting and this meeting, put together a set of packages to look at today. That's what GRS is going to go over with us. I think a goal for today might be to take those 11 packages, try to narrow those down. I think in a perfect world, we might narrow them down to one. But, it's more complex than that. So maybe we narrow them down to, 2 or 3 different packages. Maybe we make some adjustments based on the feedback that we've received between the meetings. But, I do think our goal is to, continue to make progress, continue to narrow these things down so that if we come back at a July meeting, we can make a final decision on the legislative package. I did want to mention as well that, once again, the legislature is going to have a series of town halls, or maybe just one remote town hall in the August and September timeframe. So once again, we're really working towards a package that at the end of the day, we'll take out, we'll talk to the members about, we'll get more feedback on. And so whatever we do here isn't the last stop. It's just a step along the process as we work towards the 2021 legislative session. So those are just a few things that I wanted to say to kick it off. And thank you, Madam Chair, for that.
Yes, thank you, Duncan, for those remarks. And so we'll move on to the agenda. And the first item is an action item, and it is consideration of the minutes from the May 20th, 2020 meeting. And do I have
a motion, Madam Chair, that we approve the minutes as drafted?
I have a motion from Jason Brady to approve the minutes as drafted. Do I have a second? Second from Andrea. I have a motion and a second. Any discussion on the minutes? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And the motion carries. The next item to have comment, which we're pleased to hear this morning, and they're going to comment on proposals being considered by the board. And the first person to comment will be Chris Valines from the Association of Arkansas Counties, and Jacobia is going to set Chris up so we can see him as a participant. So if we give just a minute to do that, that would be great.
Good morning.
Great. Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for joining us.
It's good to see everybody this morning. Well, most of you. I see some of you still have your names up there instead. Must not have shaved or combed your hair this morning. I really appreciate you guys and Auditor Lee. Thank you so much. I lurk in the background of most of these meetings, and I watched the last meeting, and I really appreciate your ask that we and the Municipal League get engaged and come in and visit about our positions on the changes that are being considered by the board. You may not know this, but we have roughly 18,000 county employees in the state that are in the APER system. And so it's undoubtedly the most valuable benefit that we offer to employees within county government. Unfortunately, we're woefully underpaid in county government. That's a systemic and long-term problem. But it's this benefit that helps us attract and retain good quality employees. And I want to thank all you guys, because you run along that line of balance between having a sound system and providing the benefits that help us do what we do. And I could lengthen the meeting by going through our positions on every one of the issues that y'all are looking at. I think the letter that we sent, I hope you all have had a chance to look at it. I think that letter helps identify where county government stands on these issues. And one of the biggest problems that we have is there are so many little specifics contained within the proposals that have yet to be identified that it makes it very difficult for us as a group to represent in a fair manner where we think the counties are going to rest on these issues. And so we've outlined some of the things that we think need to be determined. I will tell you the one issue that has given us more trouble in the past than anything, and this is with the 18,000 county employees and also a number of retirees, has been any change to the COLA. That seems to be something that's heavily relied upon when people join the system, when they get vested in the system, when they start targeting retirement dates, and when they get close to retirement, a lot of decisions are made based on that COLA. And then in retirement especially, their futures are determined by what they are expecting to receive. So in general, county officials and employees have a hard time with any changes to the COLA. The other three issues that are being presented, there's a spectrum of support or opposition with county employees. I will tell you it's far less opposition than you would get regarding the COLA. But I think if some of the variables on those are ironed out and we can take them back before our board, I work for a board of 18 people. And so I've got 18 people trying to represent the interests of 18,000, not dissimilar to what you guys are doing here. So as you can imagine, I've got a smaller board trying to gauge where 18,000 employees are. And sometimes they come back with what their recommendations are, but that doesn't mean that we're going to have 100% buy-in on anything out there. And so that's one of the issues that we deal with, and one of the reasons why we have to look at everything very closely. I hope that the letter outlines well enough that we don't have to get into the details of where we generally stand right now, but I stand ready to answer any questions that you all might have.
Thank you, Chris. Does the board have any questions for Chris? I think this is a great opportunity that we have him here with us to answer any questions that you might have.
Madam Chairman, it's Larry Walther.
Yeah.
I've got a question.
Go ahead.
Chris, you and I have talked from time to time about these issues. Do you have a sense of urgency, as does this board, with regard to making some changes so that we can have a retirement system that we believe will stand the test of time
So, Secretary Walther, that's a really good question. I think that we all have some level of sense of urgency. I think you'll find in the letter, I used a metaphor that APERS is a lot like a cargo ship, not a jet ski. And so I think we have a sense of urgency that things need to happen to point things in a better direction. However, you have to balance that with an overreaction that points things in a direction that might get APERS back in the situation it was in the 90s, where it's actually overfunded and benefits have been cut to the point that we lose that attraction of APERS to get people employed. And, you know, I'll talk about one example of that is you all have been discussing the move from a 5% to a 6% contribution rate. And in the last session, that was going to be implemented 0.25% per year over a 4-year period. The discussions came up in the last meeting that it might move from a 5% to a 7% contribution rate, and that would be implemented potentially over a period of 2 years. Well, I think the urgency is there to make that positional change. I think, however, if we rush to making that change over a 2-year period, then what we're going to see is, and as you know, Secretary, all state employees have been denied a raise this year. What we're going to see is we're going to see people at the bottom end of our employment who can least afford going backwards, actually seeing take-home pay reduced by 0.5% next year. And so I think what we have to do is we have to moderate that change over time, make it a long-term vision for the program, and let our revenue sources locally and at the state catch up so that many of these people don't see that drastic a reduction in pay. Hopefully it can be absorbed by potential raises over time. That 7% move is in all likelihood the right one, especially when we consider ASHERS and ATRS both moving that direction. But the benefits of that, when you look at your actuarial reports, roll out over 10, 15, 20 years. And so you're not really seeing the benefit until that far out, the ultimate benefit. So why not slow down that progression towards that model? That's kind of the position we're in. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Yep. Mr. Brady, please.
may I ask Chris a question, please?
Go ahead, please.
So first, let me say, Chris, thank you definitely for the letter. I've got a bunch of highlighted items in your letter. The one class of employees that I'm struggling with that I have also from the SEA, and so I'm probably going to ask them as well, is not the new hires, but thinking through the timeline of this legislation's proposed in the fall, or excuse me, next spring. It wouldn't go active until summer or fall. And then APERS would probably need July 1 of 2022 to enact the legislation. So the question is, that 2-year gap of folks who could potentially be hired, what I'm struggling with is if the board looked at any changes to that group of employees, particularly maybe a COLA or FAC or years of investment, where would AAC take a stand on that? And please understand, your letter was great in pointing out that there's so many variables. It's really hard right now. So I almost feel bad about trying to put you on the spot a little bit, but if you could shed a little more light on that class group for me.
Jason, thank you for the question. I'm the director at the Association of Counties. I'm used to being put on the spot. It's not a problem.
Fair enough.
And so I think where you have to go with that issue is communication. And
okay.
One thing our group does very effectively is communicate changes to our membership. And so when you are making changes that are going to affect hires between, say, May of 2021 and implementation on July 1 of 2022, the key to that is going to be making sure that we communicate to those new hires what the changes are going to be. And so we're well prepared if any changes happen to be able to disseminate that to our groups, make sure that any hiring that's done is done with that caveat. Hey, your rate's going up. The vesting period is going up. What I don't want to do is get caught in a position where we're applying some of these retroactively to people. And no matter how good a communicator we are, when you come in expecting one thing, you get something different down the road as a result of these legislative actions. But great question, and we stand ready to work with you on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else? Thank you, Chris. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Madam Chair, before I go, I want to reiterate, I thank you guys so much for what you do. Judge Hudson and I are good friends. I watch the decisions that have to be made. I know they're difficult, and I have to compliment Duncan as your executive director and Jacobia. They do a great job representing you guys at APERS. So thank you again.
Thank you. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Bye, Chris.
Bye-bye.
Next up, we're going to have Mark Municipal League, and Jacoby, if you can plug Mark in, please, so
Okay.
we could have marks from him.
Okay. Let me find Mark. And Mark. Okay, Mark, you're on. Wait a minute. You're muted. Okay, there you go.
There we go. Good morning. I'm glad I was finally able to connect. I had some pretty serious computer problems this morning. I wasn't able to do much of anything right up until 9 o'clock, and that's why I'm having to look down because I only have one screen and my camera's way up there. I apologize for the technical deficiencies. I want to thank Duncan, and I want to thank the board for its incredibly hard work to try to reverse the course of some of the issues facing APERS. I know my membership very much appreciates a long-term view financially, and to echo Chris's comments, things don't turn on a dime. We know that, and we would like to see some long-term solutions as well. This is not an easy task by any stretch of the imagination. I get a lot of phone calls from members. I suspect you get a lot too. And as soon as you start talking about the concept of benefit changes, I'm sure your phones light up like a Christmas tree. So with that, my letter is pretty self-explanatory, I think, and it follows pretty much the same things that Chris's does. He and I have been in substantial contact over the last couple of months on these many issues facing the system. And we've talked to a lot of our membership. We've talked to our membership together. I actually attended his board meeting last week, which I thought vetted a lot of this very well. So I'm happy to stand for questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, as do the 500 cities and towns in this state. As I said in the letter, it's the largest percentage of population, so we're happy to be here and to answer whatever questions the board may have.
Do any of the board members have any questions for Mark? I think he submitted a very excellent letter to the board, and now's your opportunity to ask any questions.
This may be the first time in history that I've ever stood in front of a board and not had a single question.
Mark, this is David Hudson. Being an attorney, you have a perspective on the property rights aspect of benefit changes, which you brought up in the AAC board. You might want to just review that topic briefly from your perspective.
Be happy to. For those of you who don't know, prior to becoming the executive director, I was the general counsel of the league and litigated various constitutional measures, including property rights for many years. I have a pretty profound concern that anybody who's vested or on the drop or actually retired, and if there are deep or even frankly any substantial cut into benefits, there's a pretty substantial body of law out there across the country that says those folks would have a property right in those monies. That's what they relied on in doing their financial planning over time. And the result would be litigation, which I fear would be both time consuming and expensive. One of the things that was raised, and I think it's a really good point with regard to the final averaging calculation of either 3 as it currently is or 5 years as it's being talked about, or I think even somebody mentioned 6 at one meeting. There is some room for abuse there. I'd be the first one to admit that somebody came in and got an undeserved spike the last 1 or 2 years that really drove the benefit up. As I kind of worked through all this weekend and during my conversations with Chris, one thing that might be worth contemplating would be a sort of a semi-judicial committee within the board that could look at those things individually to make sure that abuse was addressed. There are some mechanisms in state law, as I recall, it's been a while since I've looked at them, that would allow statutorily for the board to have some of those authorities. And then if it was then you'd be litigating with one person on a benefit issue as opposed to a class action, which can, as all of you know, can be horribly expensive, and seldom does the class actually come out on top, but lawyers certainly do. So that's something to think about from a legislative perspective. And I'm sorry I didn't put that in my letter. That's one of those things that when I woke up at 2 o'clock this morning, sort of finally gelled in my head, and I made a note and then tried to go back to sleep. So I think that's a real possibility for you to consider, and it might cut back some of this concern. For the most part, I don't think people do that, but there certainly are individual cases where it's gone on.
Jason.
Madam Chair, thank you. Hey, Mark, again, appreciate you being a part of this. So in line sort of my question with AAC, and your comments really triggered my thought process. Again, that group maybe that hasn't been hired today, let's say they get hired July 1 of this year, but July 1 of 2022, they're not vested. They would still be 24 months out from, or 36 months from being vested. Your knowledge of the law, would the board, if the board was to make changes to that group and affect them, would that present problems legally, you think, in your opinion, from MLA's perspective?
I don't think it would, actually. If you're not vested, which is one of the reasons that I think somebody could correct me, I may be wrong about this, but my recollection is the original vesting period in APERS was 10 years. And then it was lowered to 5 at some point, and I couldn't tell you when. I didn't look at the legislative history. So I'm moving it from 5 to 7 to 10. If you're not vested, then you have a very minimal ability to argue that you relied upon a particular set of promises. Chris's point is spot on. One of the things that is critical in a property situation, a property rights situation, is notice and communications. We are very effective at that, and we are able to get those messages out cleanly and repeatedly so that the membership fully understands it. So I don't think that body of employees, that new group, would be legally affected. I think you probably stand on, I frankly think you stand on very solid ground for those changes. It's once the vesting starts that the real concerns begin. And of course, the deeper you go into it, the harder it becomes to argue to the contrary.
Madam Chair, follow up, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Mark, thank you for that. May I also then sort of, as I told Chris, I'm going to ask to put you a little bit on the spot then. Thinking in my mind, what would be a reasonable, I guess, line in the sand or cutoff if we looked at folks who maybe are new hires or folks who are already hired before this legislation kicks in? 30 months, which would be half of 5 years, is there a line that you think it's too close? Because that was also mentioned in AAC letter of, what about folks who are right there on the cuspice of getting vested and we move the goal line? Any thoughts you could maybe share with the board of where you think would be a fair line in the sand?
Sure.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And like Chris, we're used to being put on the spot, and when you do this enough, you're happy to answer whatever the questions may be, even though I might not want to, but I'm happy to do it. And I don't know that a bright line is really necessary, except for the vesting at the current 5-year mark. So the issue would become, I'm in, and I thought it was going to be 5 years. I mean, I hate to say this, but the case law that I've read and the kind of the way most property right issues are handled, if you don't actually have the right yet, the system or the entity that may be involved has the ability to move the goal line. So if you moved it to 10 and I'm at 4 years, I really don't think I've got much in the way of an argument to the contrary. Now, from a PR standpoint, and I am no good at that at all, that's a different issue, but we can certainly spread the word so that people who are in the system understand how it's going to work. And I'll add one thing there. Chris and I have talked about this occasionally, and I've had this discussion with several city officials. One of the things that has, I think, been problematic for the system, somebody coming in and they've already got something under their belt. They've been somewhere, they've got it in the private sector or some other aspect of public service, and they've got some retirement benefit under their belt. And then they come to work in an APR situation for 5 years. And while that may seem like a good idea to get some experience, the reality is, and I call it a death by 1,000 cuts, the more people that do that, the harder it is on the system. Everybody understands that the longer people stay in, the healthier the system gets, all things being equal. So I personally would like to see that practice at least slowed down a little bit, if not totally stopped. I don't think in this day and age, a 10-year vesting period is too much to ask. And if we want people to really invest in public service, which I think is a wonderful career, and I think it's something that we need to communicate to younger people that you can have a very meaningful career working for the state or a city or a county. I don't think 10 years is too much to ask. It might have to be explained a lot, but I don't think it's too much to ask.
Mark, thank you, sir. Appreciate that.
Yes,
thank you, Madam Chair.
Andrea?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mark, I hope all is well with you and your family. Isn't another aspect of the lawsuits you're talking about defining the word substantial?
It is.
Yeah.
And that's why I mentioned earlier that, the deeper you go into people that are vested, there's certainly more of a quote unquote substantial right. Unfortunately, and there's really not a lot of Arkansas case law on this, but there is a lot in the employment arena as it relates to the property right itself. With that said, yes, that concept is out there. Not sure how it gets litigated, which is why I mentioned earlier, I think I'd rather take people on individually who think they've been wronged in some way.
Sure.
I would put it in class action.
And
divisions become very difficult when you start talking about thousands of people.
And you and I and your membership would agree that the goal in the APRS benefits was to attract people to public service and keep them on for 20, 25, 30 years. And that's the goal. And you're exactly right. Ones that just pop in, get a short vestment and pull out are are the ones that are not, I don't want to say helpful to the overall health of our, but it's not the ideal. And it wasn't the focus from my study of what a retirement system was to do. It was to give someone who vested their lives in public service. Anyway, I'm glad you're here. Thank you very much for your letter. Appreciate it.
I appreciate it, and thank you for asking about my family. As you know, it's been a difficult time, and I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Any other board member have questions for Mark this morning? Well, Mark, thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate it, and we welcome the comments. So we certainly thank you.
Thank you. Y'all have a wonderful day, and hopefully we get a little bit more rain, or at least my grass hopes we get a little bit more. Y'all take care. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Mark, I'm gonna move you back.
The next item on the agenda, John Bridges with the Arkansas State Employees Association, and have a letter from John, but unfortunately he was not able to be here due to a family emergency situation. He has sent Erica G on his behalf, and since we do have the letter, Erica is here and available to answer any questions that the board may have for her. So, Jacobia, I don't know if you're able to set up Erica or not, but
Yes, I'm gonna move her over.
that'd be great.
And she's there. Let me unmute her. Okay, Erica, you're here with us now.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you.
All right.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning on John's behalf. Do any of the board members have any questions with regard to John's letter? Jason?
Madam Chair, may I? Okay, I think we froze up here.
Go ahead.
Okay. Hey, Erica, have you, Jason Brady, have you had a chance to watch the other questions I've asked?
Yes, sir.
So
morning.
good morning to you. So you know what sort of to expect. The one area of your letter that left a little gray zone for me, and I would like to dig in, is that, again, as this board is looking at potentially moving benefits to folks from, let's say, July 1 of this year who get hired to July 1 of 2022, what would be sort of your position on those employees? And is there some sort of line that gets too close to their vesting that would make State Employees Association uncomfortable? Thoughts, please.
Well, I think the concept here that the State Employees Association, their board, has discussed, and that we tried to make clear in the letter that we provided you for the last meeting, is that the idea that many, or if not most, of the state employees decide whether or not to accept a position at the state based, at least in part, upon their retirement benefits. And you know, as Chris and Mark have pointed out, that the benefits that are available to public employee retirement can be a very big factor in making that decision. So our preference would be that any changes applied to new hires, so that decision can be part of the decision of whether to take on that position, whether to accept that position with the state, as opposed to taking the position and then having the benefits change after you've already begun working. So certainly I do agree with Mark that from a legal perspective, I don't think that is a requirement. That it only applies to new hires, but that is the concept that we've talked about, and that is not so much a legal concept as it is, I'm not going to say PR, but I think it's one of perhaps employee morale, that there wouldn't be too many changes happening once you've already begun working.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Jason. Other questions? Andrea, please.
It's been a long time since I've raised my hand to ask a question, but it seems the most logical thing on a Zoom. Erica, how are you? It's been forever since I've seen you in person.
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. So the question I have is, do you guys spend any time, and I've been to a couple of your conferences, how much time do you spend educating people on our system as a whole? I would assume a fair amount, or do you, I mean, Duncan's come and spoke to you, or our previous executive director?
Yeah, certainly the last few years, it's something that ASCA has gotten very engaged in trying to educate its membership and state employees as a whole, even those who are not members, about how APERS works and what to expect from it.
Okay. Okay. Again, thanks, John, for the letter. It was really clear, and we appreciated the input. Take care.
Well, he hated that he wasn't able to be here this morning, so thank you for letting me pinch hit.
Anyone else have any questions? If not, thank you, Erica. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's great to see you.
You too. Thank you so much.
I'm gonna move you back. Okay.
And we'll now move on to the next item of our agenda, and that's the presentation of actuarial information to continue preparation for the 2021 legislative session, and that is presented by Meta Drezeloff, David Hoffman, and Heidi Berry of GRS. And you all have the handouts that they have provided to us previously. So Meta or David, whoever wants to take it, if you will go ahead and proceed with your presentation. Duncan?
Madam Chair, and
Yes.
I may mention if, for anybody attending the meeting, they can go on our website and find these at apers.org, click the APERS board link, and then they'll find the agenda packet on the website if they need a copy of this as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I think I'm going to, Duncan, if you don't mind, I'm going to share the screen and show the presentation.
That'd be perfect. Yeah.
Okay. So hopefully everyone can see the presentation on their screens. And as has been mentioned numerous times, that this is a continuation of the discussions that we've had in February, April, and May. There's been a lot of thoughtful discussion that has happened already. At the February meeting, we talked about the evolution of the unfunded accrued liability as of June 30th, 2019. At the April board meeting, there was some context provided regarding any benefit changes that the board may wish to pursue. And the board was presented with a preview of what the June 30th, 2020 valuation results may show, depending upon various market rates of return. Remember that there was a lot of uncertainty at that time of what the fiscal year was going to entail with respect to the market value return. As a result of the discussions in April, the board requested certain supplemental valuations to be presented at the May meeting, and we did that. And as a result of a presentation of those results, the board then followed up with Duncan. And let me just take this opportunity to thank Duncan, Carlos, and Jason for their assistance in helping put together this presentation and getting all of the information from the board to allow us to evaluate the packages that you're going to be seeing today. There were a total of 11 packages that were submitted from various board members. In addition to that, there was certain historical information about APERS investment return, inflation, and employer contribution rates that was requested to be presented by various board members. So here is basically a 20-year history of the market rate of return. You can see that between 2001 and 2010, after the, basically I'll call it the go-go years of the 80s and 90s, unfortunately the next 10 years were a pretty rude awakening, where on average the system only earned about 2.6% over that 10-year period, as opposed to the 8% assumption that was the actual assumption during those fiscal years. There's been a nice recovery in the next decade, 2011 through 2019, so that the 9-year average is 9.5% in comparison to the 9-year average of our assumption of 7.7%. And also remember that the board in the past few years has lowered their expectation of what investment return the system can expect to earn on an actuarial basis going forward. So initially it got reduced from 8 to 7.75, then to 7.5, and then to the current assumption of 7.15. Here is a table showing the change in the consumer price index over the last basically 19 years. And you can see that the 10-year average from 2001 to 2010 is about 2.37%. And for the last 9 years, it's about 1.74%. Some years, there have been years where it has been higher than 3%. So for example, 2001, 2006, and most recently, actually 2018. But you can see that in many years, the increase in the CPI has been less than the current 3% COLA provision. There was a request to show the employer contribution rates over the last 20 years. And remember that we had talked back in February that as a result of basically investment income falling short, it's pretty much fallen on the employer contribution rate. So back in the early 2000s, the employer contribution rate was 10%. It got up to about 12.54%. There was some recovery back in 2007 and just before the financial crisis that allowed it to drop back to 11. But after the financial crisis, it's pretty much been a one-way street with the employer contribution rate going up. So basically 12.5% in 2009 to basically 13.5%, and then 14.5%, and the current employer contribution rate of 15.32%. And please, if there are any questions that the board may wish to ask, I'd be more than happy to take them at any time.
I just want to make a note on that last slide. Oh gosh, I almost called you Mita when I looked at your picture.
That's fine.
This is, people need to be reminded, I guess members, and I need to remind myself when I look at a chart like this, that money is being drawn from the general fund, that their paychecks are coming out of as well. I mean, basically we're printing money. We're an unusual system in that we can raise that to help ourselves out, to help ourselves being the system out. We can raise that amount just by a vote of the board, which is, in my opinion, similar to being able to just print money. And it comes out of the employers, which is the general fund of the state of Arkansas. Anyway, I think that's always good to note that this isn't money that's just out there in the Netherlands.
Okay, thank you. So as I mentioned, as a result of the May 20th board meeting, a total of 11 supplemental valuation packages were requested by various board members. The benefit changes generally fell into the following categories. The member contribution rate changes for contributory members. And remember that the current provision is a 5% of payroll member contribution rate. One is a change to the final average compensation period. The current provision is a 3-year period. Most of the changes that we saw related to a 5-year period. I think there was one change where it was a 6-year period. There were some vesting period changes. The current provision of a 5-year period, there was some consideration to extending it to 8, and I think in 10 in some instances. as well as some proposed changes to the cost of living allowance provision. Now, there was a request to show how the requested changes to the cost of living provision would actually affect a member's benefit. So right now, the current provision is the 3% compound provision. So this table shows for an individual, a member who would have retired in June of 2010 with an initial computed benefit of $10,000, how that member's benefit would have increased over basically the period through 2019 or 2020, given the various provisions. So the 3% compound column there, it's basically, you know, the starting benefit 10,000 times 1.03, which gives 10,300, times 1.03 again, 10,609, and so forth, with a final benefit there of 13,439. If the provision in place would have been the lesser of 3% or CPI, that also shows the evolution. So for example, in the very first year, the change in CPI wasn't as high as 3%, it was 1.36%. So in that instance, the individual would have received a compound COLA based upon the 1.36% provision. So instead of receiving 10,300, they would have received 10,136. The very next year, the change in CPI was 4.06%. So they would have been capped at 3% in that instance. And that 10,136 would have been increased by 1.03% to get to the 10,440. Similarly, on the right, instead of a compound COLA, we're showing a simple COLA. So basically a simple COLA, the way to think about it on the 3% column is the annual COLA increase is $300. It's 3% of your base benefit. So the member retires with a computed benefit of $10,000. So each year they get an increase of $300. It doesn't compound, it just adds, and that's why we call that the simple COLA. On the situation where it was lesser of 3% or the change in the CPI, for example, in the very first year, the increase would have been 1.36%. So they would have got an increase of $136. In the following year, where the change in the CPI was 4.06%, that would have been capped at 3, so they got an increase of $300 from the 10,136 to the 10,436, excuse me. So you can see what the final amounts were for the various individuals. Obviously, the 3% compound COLA is the most generous. The 3% simple, at least in this example, would have been next, and then the lesser of 3% or CPI compound is always going to be a higher benefit for the member than a simple COLA. The board, in addition to the 4 categories we talked about, the board also had variations about which groups may or may not be affected by any of the legislative changes. So some provisions were to only apply to new hires. Some provisions were to apply to new hires and non-vested members. Some provisions were to apply to all active members. And some provisions were to apply to all non-retired members, excluding drop participants. So the board also had, even if they had a similar provision that they wanted to see evaluated, they may have applied it to a different class of the membership. The board, with respect to the member contribution rate changes, also had different phase-in periods. So there was a 2-year phase-in period, there was 4, I think there was a 5, and I think there was an 8 as well. So there's some differences there. And on these 2 slides here, you can see a summary of the packages that were asked by us to be evaluated. So package 1 was a 6.5% member contribution rate with the 2-year phase-in. And all of the member contribution rate, the groups affected were always all contributory members. For the FAC period, package 1 was a 6-year period. I believe every other package was a 5-year FAC period. Now, the way we evaluated that provision was we did have a hold harmless provision for if it applied to all active members. So for example, in package 2, for an active member, we computed their 3-year FAC and said, okay, then going forward, we'll compute your 5-year FAC. But if your 5-year FAC was less than your frozen 3-year FAC at the time of the benefit change, you got the benefit of that 3-year FAC. So we had the hold harmless provision when we did the FAC period changes when it had affected all active members. You can see that the vesting period was package 1, 10 years, package 2, 8 years, packages 3, 4, and 5 on this instance was a 5-year period, the current provision. The only package that we evaluated where the COLA did not change was package 1. It remained 3% compound, and that was for all members. The other COLA provisions that were evaluated was the lesser of 3% or CPI, which you can see in packages 2 through 5. In those instances, though, those only affected new hires. So these are packages 6 through 11. And 6 through 11 had a lot of the same provisions, similar provisions, as some of the other packages we've seen. It was either a 6 or a 7% member contribution rate, and either a 2 or a 4-year phase-in period. The FAC period got increased from 3 years to 5 years. The vesting period increased to 10 years. But for packages 6 through 11, there was a little bit of a nuance with respect to the COLA. And that was, it did not remain compound. On all of these packages, it got switched from a compound COLA to a simple COLA. In addition, packages 8, 9, 10, and 11 were the only packages that affected a broader portion of the membership. And that was all non-retired members excluding drop. And there's one thing to think about with respect to those packages 8 through 11. And that's covered in a little bit later slide. But it's something called rush to the door. And that's something we're going to talk about. But the board has seen this slide before. This was presented in the May presentation. So the first way we evaluated all of the packages was to say, okay, what if those packages were actually in place in the June 30th, 2019 valuation? And we presented it in different ways. So column A on the next slide would have been the decrease in the June 30th, 2019 amortization period if the board maintained an employer contribution rate of 15.32%. Column B is what the reduction in the computed employer contribution rate would have been